Hi you guys, so today I'm going to be discussing and sharing some basic beginner sewing terminology, and basically the things that I'm going to mention in this video are things that I know that I tend to say a lot, like seam allowance and pattern and hem and things like that. And if you've watched any other tutorials, I'm sure you've heard these terms as well. I don't consider myself to be a professional or like a guru or a master of sewing and the correctness of it all, but I will say that I have been sewing for many years and that I've learned a lot along the way, and so everything that I've learned that's helpful, I'm going to share it with you, okay? Alright, so let's get into it. Seam allowance. What is seam allowance? So seam allowance basically gives you extra space. So if you have a shirt and you turn it inside out, especially along the side seams for example, you can see that there's like a small extra flap of fabric that's just kind of like, you can move it, and basically that is the seam allowance. So the easiest way to understand this is by just taking your clothes, turning them inside out, and trying to find the seam allowance. And you can find the seam allowance as that extra like flap of fabric. So why is seam allowance important? Why do I need seam allowance? So you need seam allowance because if you cut a pattern and you don't add seam allowance, when you sew two pieces of a pattern together, your garment is actually going to be smaller than what it should be. So seam allowance helps you to get the right sizing of your garment. And this is extremely important if you're not dealing with stretchy fabric. So if you're dealing with like cotton, wool, or denim or something like that, you definitely need to be aware of seam allowance. Sometimes you can get away with it if you're dealing with like a knit fabric or stretchy fabric where if you don't add it, it's okay because it might still stretch a bit. Does it have to be perfect? No, not per se. So a lot of the times when I am doing a tutorial, I'll tell you guys, okay, so once you have your pattern, now you want to add seam allowance around your pattern. A lot of the times I'll tell you guys, you can use your measuring tape to add the seam allowance, or you can just eyeball it. Now when I say eyeball it, it means you're not getting accurate measurements around the pattern, but you're still leaving enough space so that once you sew, you won't have a garment that's smaller than it needs to be. So it does not have to be perfect, but you do need to make sure that you leave enough space around the original line, because either way you're going to be sewing on the original line, and once you finish sewing on the original line, then you create what is called the seam. So seam allowance, how much space does it have to be? Most of the time in my tutorials I always say about a ½ inch. Sometimes I'll say an inch. I think as long as you have like at least a ½ inch, I would say you're good. Because again, remember the objective is to have enough space around your original line so that your garment is not smaller. What is seam? So seam is basically what you get when you sew along the original line of a pattern. So not the seam allowance line. How do we hear seam in context? So a lot of the times if you're dealing with alterations, so an alteration is when you're taking a garment that has already been made and you're changing it. So whether you're taking jeans and you're turning it into a skirt, a seam is basically the stitches that connect two or more pieces of a garment. Most of the time, once you take your seam out, you're able to separate the garment into different pieces. So materials related to seam allowance and seam. A seam gauge. And a seam gauge is basically a substitute for having to manually use a measuring tape to mark the seam allowance distance around a pattern. Instead, if you use a seam gauge, you can just kind of measure the seam allowance distance, fold your fabric over, and then continue this all around the pattern. I left a link to a very helpful video that deals with how to use a seam gauge. It's in the description box. The other tool that you'll hear that's connected with seam allowance and seam is a seam ripper or a seam cutter. I prefer to use a seam cutter because I just feel like it's easier to just cut the threads rather than having to pluck up with with the seam ripper. If you're dealing with something like denim that has like a sturdier thread, when you're using a seam ripper, it's like you have to pull a little harder and then you get a little scared that maybe the part is gonna break. Whereas with the seam cutter, you just cut it and it's done. Boom, boom, boom. Most of the time, if you go to like a dollar store or like a craft store or something like that, you can find these materials in one kit. A lot of the times you'll find like thread, and then you'll find like a seam gauge, and then you'll find like the scissors, the seam cutter, seam ripper. If you don't have access to a dollar store or any store, a craft store near you, you can check out the links in the description, and you can order a little kit for yourself, or you can order the pieces separately and create a kit for yourself. So I am gonna end the video here, only because I don't want to spend a good 10 minutes explaining so many terms to you guys. I would rather just divide the terms so that I can make sure that you understand everything that I'm talking about to the best of my ability. So with that being said, that means that if you want to learn more terminology, more tips, more techniques, you should check out the other parts of this mini series. Alright, and of course if you have any questions, be sure to leave me a comment and let me know if there's something in particular that you'd like me to talk about. Until next time, ciao.